All right, welcome everyone. I'm just going to turn this over to Tegan to go over the virtual meeting guidelines like we usually do. Please take it away, Tegan.
Thank you, Steve. So just a reminder for everyone as to our virtual meeting guidelines. You are all joining us muted. Please do not try to mute or unmute yourself if at all possible. If you mute yourself after you speak, you will have to approve being unmuted by the host in the future. When you join, please do rename yourself. You should be able to do that in your window where you see your video information. And if you are an MPO, oops, we're losing the slides. I think I'm seeing the screen that's jumping around. There you go.
Sorry about that.
And please rename yourself. And if you are a board member, please put a comma after your name and then MPO member in your affiliation. As a reminder, when we do roll calls, which we will do at the outset, and then when there is a vote required, if you are an MPO member, please use the raise hand function to bring your name to the top of the participant list. So it is easy for us to find you, unmute you, and allow you to speak out when we are doing the roll call. Please remember to repeat your name for the record since this meeting is being recorded. If you are a member of the public or otherwise and would like to make a comment during the public comment period or otherwise, please also use the raise hand function. You can do that at the bottom of your screen. There is a button that says participants. And then once you click on that, you get a list of all participants, and there's a button on your screen that allows you to raise your hand. If you're on the phone, you should be able to raise your hand by pressing *9. And if you have any problems or challenges, please feel free to message the host in the text messaging function. I believe that covers it.
All right, I think the next thing is the accessibility statement. Yes, so I'll read that. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Roisin Foley, MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or 857-702-3704. All right, next slide. I would think it's agenda. All right, so first item on agenda is introductions. Jonathan, can you read the roll?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. MassDOT Chairman.
Steve Wolfel, Representative Secretary and CEO of MassDOT, Stephanie Pollock.
Okay. MassDOT Representative 2. Okay. MassDOT Highway. Okay. MBTA.
Good morning. This is Samantha Silverberg, MBTA Deputy Chief Administrative Officer.
Thank you. Massport.
Good morning. This is Laura Gilmore with the Massachusetts Port Authority.
MAPC.
Good morning. This is Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board. Good morning.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Morning, this is Leonard Diggins, Chair of the Advisory Council.
Thank you. City of Boston, BTD. Okay, I'll come back to them. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hello, Jim Fitzgerald from BPDA representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston. And I know Tom, I just talked to him a couple minutes ago. He should be on the line. So maybe he's having a couple of technical issues.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I see him in the list. Okay, City of Everett, at large.
Jay Monte, City of Everett, representing Mayor DiMaria.
Thank you. At large City Newton.
David Kozis, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller.
Thank you. At large Arlington.
Yes, this is Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington at large town, representing Select Board Chair Diane Mahan and MPO towns.
Thank you. At large town Lexington.
This is Sheila Page, representing Doug Lucente, the Chair of the Select Board of Lexington and representing MPO communities.
Great. Intercore Somerville.
The City of Somerville, Mayor Joe Curtatone in the inner core.
Thank you. Magic Acton. Okay. Metro West Framingham. North Shore Beverly.
Sorry, did I mess that up? No, I did it. Okay. Darlene Wynn here from Beverly.
Thank you. North Suburban Woburn.
Sorry, my apologies. Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin and the North Suburban Planning Council.
Thank you. South Shore Rockland.
Jennifer Constable, Town of Rockland, representing South Shore Coalition.
Thank you. Swap Medway. Okay. Trick Norwood NRC.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke, Town of Norwood, representing the Trick sub-region.
Thank you. And I think I saw Mr. Bouchard come on for MassDOT.
Yes, I'm on, Jonathan. I was having trouble getting in this morning.
Okay, thank you. I'll then just, our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
Thank you. FTA. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Oh, was somebody say
I do know
something?
that Tom Kadzis is here. Just want to maybe try to get him on once more.
Sure.
Tom, I'm trying to unmute you. It does not seem to be working. There we go.
Hello.
Hi,
Yes.
Tom.
Hey, Tom.
Tom Kazis, representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Tom.
All right, next item agenda is a chair's report. I do not believe I have one. So the next agenda item is agenda item 3, the executive director's report. Tegan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize. I actually just noticed the time limit. I do not have a 15-minute report. So you can expect maybe closer to my usual, up to 5 minutes. So I just wanted to first mention to the board that Roisin has reached out to you to sign a virtual card saying thank you to Paul Regan for his service on the board, representing the MBTA Advisory Board. We know that a virtual card does not do his service justice, but in the COVID-19 world, we'll certainly do what we can to show him our appreciation. So please do sign it. If you have any questions or didn't get the link, please feel free to reach out to me or to Roisin fully to ask get that link or answer any questions. Next, I wanted to give an outreach event highlight. We did hold a UPWP virtual open house on June 8th, and we will hold another one on June 23rd. So please feel free to attend or send anyone that you would like to attend to discuss the UPWP. Next, I did want to touch on the CTPS 5-year strategic planning process, which we have talked about a few times at the board. It is officially underway. We had a very brief kickoff last week, and we are working right now on forming the steering committee. And we expect that steering committee to start in a few weeks. We will have about 19 or 20 members of the steering committee, with about 3/4 of them being staff from a wide range of experience levels, et cetera. And then we also have some additional spots for representatives from the board, from MassDOT as the board chair, from NEPC as our fiduciary agent, and a member of the board, and also a spot for our federal partners. So I did reach out to Len Diggins as the MPO representative because of his role in RTEC, and we all felt that that was a very important role because he represents broader stakeholder input into the board. And if anybody else from the board is strongly interested or has a suggestion or would like to participate, please reach out to me and let me know. We could add another slot, but I do want to emphasize that this is only for the steering committee, which involves about an additional 30 hours or so, not additional, 30 hours or so of work over about 6 months. So it is a significant time commitment to participate in meetings, meeting preparation, and document review. And we will have a separate process to continue to engage the board throughout the process regardless. So you do not have to join the steering committee to be involved in our strategic planning process. So again, anyone just feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or want to make any suggestions. Okay, moving on to today. We are looking forward to having you discuss and hopefully approve our state fiscal year 2021 budget, which we've already discussed this morning at the Administration and Finance Committee, and Tina Cassidy will tell you more about it and walk you through that. We also have 2 work scopes to approve. One is a scope for the MBTA to estimate data for the National Transit Database, or NTD submission. This is work that is paid for with non-NPO funding, and it will not conflict with MPO work, but just as a reminder, when we have a significant effort like this that we are engaging in as MPO staff, we do bring it to the board for your knowledge, for your consideration and approval. Our other scope is MPO funded work. It's innovations in estimating trip generation rates, and that's our proposal to replace part of the originally intended UPWP discrete study called Transit Mitigation. I think it had a longer title, my apologies. And then we'll come back to you in another meeting, because that only replaces part of that study, with another scope of work to sort of finish out replacing that study we intended originally to carry out this year, but realized that it had overlap with work that other organizations, including MassDOT, were doing. Next, we have another TIP Amendment 5, and it involves flexing ferry boat funding from the FHWA to the MBTA for ferry overhauls, and Matt Genova will talk more about that. And then the bulk of our meeting will turn back to the TIP criteria revisions. And again, Matt Genova will be primarily speaking on that. We'll be talking about both the safety and the economic vitality criteria. I did want to just say a few things about this in advance, which is first, as you well know, I hope, the criteria themselves are a part, but not all of how you select projects for funding with the target funds that you select projects for. But it is a very important part, and it helps sort of guide people's stakeholders' understanding and sort of what the MPO goals are and what their projects can do to sort of meet those goals. And I wanted to comment, because we had been talking about equity and how equity overlays onto these various TIP criteria. I just wanted to comment that, given the board's interest in this topic, and given the acknowledged long history of inequitable investment in vulnerable populations, which right now is really punctuated by these horrible recent tragic killings of people of color, we want to really work with you to continue to enhance how we meaningfully incorporate those equity measures into the TIP criteria. So you've supported this. We've been trying to work with you on this, and Betsy Harvey will step in after Matt discusses each set of criteria to talk about that equity overlay. Betsy Harvey is the one who manages our transportation equity program. And I just want to emphasize to you that we are very willing to engage in a conversation with you and to get your input as to whether or not we're meeting your needs and whether or not we're meeting the intent of the things we heard from the board and others during our disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens working group conversations. So again, we welcome that conversation. And then finally, our next meetings will be on June 25th and then on July 16th. July 16th puts us back on our normal meeting schedule. We are canceling the July 2nd meeting for, I hope, understandable reasons, given that it's the July 4th week. So June 25th and then July 16th. And thank you, Mr. Chair. That is all.
All right, thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? All right, seeing none. Next item agenda is agenda item 4, public comments. Any members of the public would like to address the MPO today? Are we getting any responses? I can't tell.
Yes, we have Jared Johnson.
All right, go ahead, sir. Please identify, let us know your name and your organization you're with, please.
Great. Hi, my name is Jared Johnson, and I am the Director of Transit Matters. You know, in light of you know, the unrest and the conversation about race, I just wanted to take this opportunity to address the MPO. So I'm sure as many of you know that race and transportation have been linked for the majority of our history, you know, whether it was Chinese, you know, people of Chinese descent coming over to America for the first time to build the railroads and then facing discrimination after that when they discovered it was never the US's plan for them to live there afterwards. Or Dred Scott, you know, the origin of separate but equal, you know, originated on a train. And then, of course, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycotts. And then, you know, coming back to Boston, the freeway revolts, which I know is a big part of the founding of the MPO. But I think now this takes us to what's the next step, because we still have so many issues unsolved today. There was a really impactful study that MAPC recently produced talking about highway proximity and talking about how people of color, you know, face a disproportionate, you know, percentage of the pollution from highways. That 45% of the region's Black residents, 47% of the region's Asian residents, and 54% of the region's Latino residents live in the highest polluted areas, compared to only 29% of the region's white residents. And this is especially relevant in light of COVID. As I said, there's still so much work to be done. Indeed, there are issues that have persisted for generations, such as the fact that Dudley Square and parts of Roxbury, access from those places has actually gotten worse since the 60s because of, you know, the moving of the Orange Line and traffic. Travel times from Mattapan are some of the highest in the region, even higher than those from some suburban areas outside of the city of Boston. You know, we can also look at the gross inequity of the Tobin Bridge, where Latino residents from the near North Shore communities pay twice as much to rent the bus as wealthier white commuters coming from further north, and they face gruelingly long commutes on these buses. Also, the Union of Concerned Scientists found that Chinatown was the highest polluted census tract in the whole Commonwealth, likely because of the freeway ramps and South Station's diesel trains there and the number of buses coming in and out of there. You know, so revisiting the highway revolts, you know, one of the root causes of this, beyond obvious racism, was a lack of representation. And I know that making the MPO board more representative is a long-term project, but this must be a priority. And an area to start is engagement. And no, it's not enough for people like me, despite the fact that I'm obviously Black and I live in Dorchester, I'm not representative. I grew up in a majority white suburb of Oklahoma, and I have a biography of Jane Jacobs on my nightstand. So I'm not quite the exact demographic of the community. And, you know, one of the things that's unfortunate, you know, about sort of how things have been done in the past is that, you know, the great work of the MPO goes unnoticed often. So, you know, I hope that this is an opportunity, you know, for real inclusive community engagement around MPO plans and on projects that have MPO funding or that the MPO has a veto over. And that even ahead of those projects, even when there aren't, you know, projects going on or MPO plans, that there's real outreach, proactive outreach that is in plain language and is able to translate it. You know, I was incredibly glad to see Executive Director Titch's commitment to addressing these issues in her email, and I hope that they can be given the funding and support that they need. You know, the world is changing, whether it's the Green New Deal or efforts to shift resources from, you know, policing to other priorities, including transportation. And so this is an opportunity for us to sit with the discomfort, and to think about how we can design inclusive processes ahead of some of these big changes so that when these resources become available, we're able to move forward in a way that is really inclusive and really prioritizes those communities that have been left behind, and that this conversation doesn't just end with conversations about policing, but that extends to the many, many different facets of our society in which racism has been made manifest and has continued to exist. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate that. All right, any other members of the public would like to address the MPO today? Am I safe to say there's no other folks that would like to address the MPO?
Seeing none. I'm seeing
All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Johnson. So we're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is the committee chair's report, agenda number 5. Are there any committee chairs that have any reports? I'm guessing Tina will, but I'm assuming we'll wait till agenda item 7, I think, would be my guess.
Yep.
Okay. So no other chairs have any reports. Okay. The next agenda item is agenda item 6, Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Leonard?
I thought I left my microphone unmuted. Anyways, so the advisory council met yesterday, and we were preparing for our 3-3 report on the UPWP. So Sandy Johnson talked with us, and we had a good discussion about the current draft. And so that draft is well in the way, and I think the MPO will be happy with what we have to say. And so if you will just indulge me a couple more minutes about some personal things, which will actually relate to the MPO, I would appreciate it, because no one's going to want to hear this at 12:45 on the new business. First, thank you. So first, I would like to let you know that thanks to the wonderful folks in Arlington, I was elected to be on the select board. And unfortunately for Dan Amstutz, that means he's still going to be here. And so because I'm going to continue representing the RTAC, because one of the big things that I ran on was the regional approach to the big issues, one of which, of course, is transportation. And I have very much enjoyed my work with the Advisory Council and my work with the MPO, not only as part of the Advisory Council, but as part of the MBTA Rider Oversight Committee. And before I say a little bit more on that, I do want to thank some people related to the MPO and that Dempster in the beginning, who really encouraged me to do this when I was really struggling with the decision whether to go for it, because I wasn't asked to do this by members of the community, and she very much gave me strong encouragement, and she's been encouraging all along, even as a member of the Rider Oversight Committee before I became a member of RTAC. And I do want to say that not only has CTPS been a big supporter and welcoming to everyone on the Rider Oversight Committee, but I've always been so proud of the way that the MPO has approached equity issues. I was invited to participate in the development of the DBDI policy, which is the disproportionate, I'm about to blank out on this, disproportionate, I know it's disparate impact and disproportionate, I'm blanking out on the beat, but anyways, burden. Thank you very much. And the MPO has gone beyond what the feds have required on that, and I know from my work with folks to me that they really care about this issue. It's not simply lip service. And also, as a member of the Rider Oversight Committee, who's gone through several cycles of trying to get new members. I don't know if we haven't reached out in the right way, but we have struggled not only to get a more minority representation from communities within Boston, but we've also tried to get more women, and we've selected with that in mind very heavily, and sometimes they'll join, but often the pool just isn't there, and so will say that if in light of this, people want to join the Right Oversight Committee or RTAC, our doors are open, okay, but I will also finally add that even though there may be a lack of diversity in the obvious visible phenotypes, I know that in the minds and hearts of the people that I have been working with on the Right Oversight Committee, the MBTA, and the MPO, that equity is something that they really care about and take very seriously. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leonard. Congratulations. Any questions for Leonard? Okay. Seeing now we're on to agenda item 7. It's an action item. CTPS's state fiscal year 2021 operating budget. I'm going to turn it over to Tina, who is acting as interim chair of the ANF committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to members of the audience. I am the interim chair of the ANF committee, which met this morning to review and discuss a draft state fiscal year 2021 operating budget for central transportation planning staff. We were aided greatly by a number of staff members, including Haral Gandhi, who is our director of finance and operations group. And she provided us with an overview, as you'll see here in a memo, provided us with an overview not only of expected revenues, which I'm happy to report are stable and multifaceted from approximately about 75% of our expected revenue is from federal sources, about 13% from MassDOT, about 8% from the MBTA, and then a combination of other funding sources will give us a revenue of about $6,448,000. We reviewed a budget for the upcoming fiscal year that would equal that same amount of money. It would be funding for a total of 58 positions and their operations. There are approximately 7 vacancies now that we would anticipate filling during the fiscal year. The budget does represent for this coming fiscal year a modest increase of 3%, which is about a little over what the current fiscal year at $6.2 million plus or minus. Just as a footnote, it's probably important to note that our current fiscal year, FY 2020, is expected to end with approximately about 12% savings in terms of expenditures versus what was expected and budgeted. After a review of the proposed budget, which did include a detailed 5-year plan, as many of you who've been on the MPO for a number of years will know, the CTPS budget includes a line item for improvements and investments in computer and data related equipment. And there is a 5-year plan, a rolling 5-year plan that staff put together for our review, where every year we apply some funding to the computer related needs of CTPS. And that is in fact incorporated again this year. All in, after review, the committee members reviewed the proposed budget at $6,448,000. And I'm pleased to report that they unanimously recommended to the MPO that you approve the budget as proposed. Haral and I and Tegan would be available to answer any questions if any members have any that are specific.
All right, so thank you for that, Tina. So can I get a motion a second to approve the budget for this year? And then I'll open up to questions and then we'll do the roll. So can I get a motion a second?
Eric?
I make the motion to approve the CTPS annual budget.
Thanks, Eric. Is there a second?
Daniel?
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, seconds.
All right, any questions for either Tina, Tegan, or Haral?
Seeing none.
All right, Jonathan, can you run the roll, please?
Absolutely. Stephen Wolfel,
Yes.
John Romano, John Bouchard,
Yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
On Saturday? Okay. All right.
I would keep going.
yep,
Yeah.
okay. MAPC, Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Mike. I would also come back to Brian.
okay. Leonard Diggins,
Yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Do you have me now?
Yep.
Yep.
I have to, just to let you know, I have to unmute it. So give me a second. There's something that comes up that says the host wants me to unmute. So I click it, but I'm not muted, just to let you know. But yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes. Yes.
thank you. Thank you. Jay Monty,
Yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
thank you. Sheila Page,
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Yes. Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Thank you. We'll just go back, Mr. Chair, to Laura Gilmore at Massport.
Laura Gilmore, yes.
All right.
And Brian Kane at the MBTA Advisory Board.
Yeah, sorry, my multitasking skills failed me there. Brian Kane, yes.
Okay, motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right. So the budget's in place for the next year. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tina, for taking over in your interim basis. So can we bring up the agenda? Next agenda item is agenda 8, action item. It's a work scope, Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority State Fiscal Year 2021 National Transit Database. And I believe the member of MPO staff is Bradley Putnam.
Morning, everyone. I'm here to present the work scope for the MBTA State Fiscal Year 2021 National Transit Database Project. The CTPS has been assisting the MBTA with their work in the National Transit Database for many years, and this work scope represents a continuation of that work. As Tegan mentioned earlier, the MBTA will pay for this work. The budget is $123,000. The project is scheduled to last for 18 months. The objective of the project is to collect data and analyze it in order to assist the MBTA in developing estimates of ridership and passenger miles traveled on the various modes that they operate. And the MBTA uses those estimates as part of their required annual submission to the National Transit Database. The modes that CTPS will collect and analyze data on include heavy rail, light rail, bus, rapid bus, trackless trolley, purchase service bus routes. One thing that's new this year is the MBTA has requested that CTPS assist them in developing ridership estimates on substitute bus service, which is when a portion of rail service is out of service for a period of time for construction or other reasons. And so CTPS will be assisting the MBTA in estimating ridership on that mode as well. Another thing that's new this year, of course, is COVID-19. And so we've added a line of text to the scope this year that states that CTPS will work with our partners at the MBTA to modify our sampling plans as needed in response to the ongoing pandemic. Other than that, the work is mostly similar to what has happened in previous years, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, so can I get a motion and a second to approve this work scope? Then I'll open up to questions for Bradley.
Eric,
Eric Barassa, MAPC, I make a motion to approve this work scope.
and Tom,
Tom Bent, I second.
All right, anyone have any questions for Bradley? Anyone pop up?
Brian, do you have one?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Mr. Chairman, that as someone who's worked on this both inside the T and outside the T, this is a critically important role that CTPS plays in getting this very important data. It's the only way that we have to compare the T against its peers, and it's critical that it get done correctly, and CTPS is by far the best positioned organization to do that. So I urge all my colleagues to vote in the affirmative. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Anyone else? Okay. Jonathan, can you read the roll?
Sure. Steve Wolfle.
Yes.
I'll come back to John Bouchard. He just let me know he's having connection issues. Samantha Silverberg.
Yes.
Laura Gilmore.
Yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Thank you. Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis.
Tom Kadzis, yes.
Thank you. Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes, for Jim Fitzgerald.
Jay Monty.
Yes.
David Kozas.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page.
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, yes. Yep.
Thank you. Darlene Nguyen.
Arlene Wynn, yes.
Tina Cassidy.
Yes, I'm sorry, Tina Cassidy, yes.
Thank you. Jennifer Constable.
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
And is John Bouchard back on?
Not seeing him.
Okay. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Jonathan and Bradley. We're on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 9. It's another action item. It's a work scope, innovations in estimating trip generation rates. Bradley, it's you again.
Hello again, everyone. So this is a work scope for innovations in estimating trip generation rates. As Tegan mentioned earlier, this year's UPWP had previously programmed a $60,000 project to study transit mitigation, but that work is already being carried out in other venues. And so it was decided to repurpose this $60,000 to other uses. And so one project that we're proposing to do with a portion of that money, with $30,000 of that, is this project on innovations in estimating trip generation rates. As you know, when a new development is built, an important aspect of the planning process is to estimate how many new transportation trips the development will generate in order to understand how new development will impact the surrounding region and the transportation network at large. And traditionally, these trip generation rates have been sourced from a manual produced by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, but that manual is based on data that has generally been collected from suburban single-use sites. And so the manual tends to overestimate the number of vehicle trips that will be generated, and it excludes trips that are taken by transit, bicycling, or walking. And so in this study, staff proposed to research innovative approaches to estimating trip generation and to research best practices for developing new trip generation rates for urban areas that better account for trips made by transit, bicycle, and on foot. So this research will inform and support a number of ongoing and upcoming efforts in the Boston region to improve trip generation rates used by all modes. So we would ask for your support of this project, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, before I open up the questions, can I get a motion and second to approve the work scope?
Eric,
I'll make the motion to approve this work scope.
and Daniel,
Daniel Amstutz seconds the motion.
All right, are there any questions for Bradley?
Sheila, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question, which I'm not sure this would be in the scope, but I'm wondering, would this take into account people that take bicycles on public transit, either on the buses or carrying them onto the trains? I guess they're not allowed on the T.
That's a good question. I think it would depend on, I'll let others speak to this after me if they have more to add, but I believe it would be the trip, the mode by which someone arrives at the final destination. So if someone took a bicycle to transit, I'm guessing that would count as a transit trip, but I think it would depend on the level of detail that is being studied. I don't know if Annette or others have anything to add on that.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
Glenn?
I just wanted to add, I mean, bikes are allowed on the T at certain times and on the trains.
And I do see that Annette may have a comment.
All right, go ahead, Annette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to clarify that this is basically a literature review and then talking to individuals who have developed these innovative strategies. So it really depends on what others have developed, which modes would be taken into account and how they've processed their data. So if other people have looked into bikes on transit, then we would be looking at something like that. But we're not developing our own methodology here. We're just seeing what best practices are now in the field.
All right, anyone else?
Seeing none.
All right, Jonathan, please call the roll.
Okay, Steve Wolfel.
Yes.
I don't believe John Bouchard is back, so we can come back to him. Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore, come back. Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Tom Kansas, yes.
thank you. Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page,
Sheila Page, yes.
thank you. Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Tom O'Rourke,
Yes.
and Laura Gilmore.
Yes.
And is John Bouchard back?
Not seeing him.
Okay, motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Bradley, for that. So the next agenda item is another action item. It's federal fiscal years 20 to 24 Transportation Improvement Program Tip Amendment 5. Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and hello, everyone. So for my first of 3 presentations today, I'll be giving you an overview of Amendment 5 to the federal fiscal years 2020 through 2024 TIP. This comes fast on the heels of Amendment 4, which was endorsed by this board at our last meeting on May 28th. So there are 2 tables posted to the MPO meeting calendar under today's date that detail the contents of Amendment 5. One table is a summary of the amendment itself, and the other table is the full tip tables with the amendment included and highlighted. So Amendment 5 includes just one project, which is the midlife overhaul of MBTA ferry vessels. This project is being paid for using Federal Highway Administration ferry boat program funds, though these funds are being flexed to the Federal Transit Administration to carry out the project. For this reason, the project is shown in the highway portion of the TIP rather than the transit portion because it's being funded using highway dollars. The project's total cost is just over $1.1 million and is proposed for funding in the current federal fiscal year, which is fiscal year 2020. Pending a vote by this body, Amendment 5 will be released for a 21-day public review period, putting it on track for a final vote at the July 16th MPO meeting. So that's all I have on TIP Amendment 5. And with that, I will turn it back over to the chair for questions.
All right, can I get a motion and a second to release Amendment number 5 to the TIP out for 21-day public comment period?
Eric?
Make a motion to release the Amendment 5 for the public comment.
And Tina?
Yes, I will second that motion.
All right, thank you both. Any questions for Matt?
Seeing none.
All right, Jonathan, please do the roll.
Steve Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard. Still not back.
Still not seeing him.
Okay, Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page,
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Okay, I do not see John Bouchard. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right. We are on to agenda item 11. It is not an action item. It's a discussion point. TIP project selection criteria, initial proposed safety criteria revisions. And it's Matt and Betsy.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me just get set up here. So for my second presentation today, I will walk you all through the changes that we are proposing for the safety criteria used to evaluate prospective TIP projects. Before we start, I do want to direct you to a companion table for this presentation, which has been posted to the MPO meeting calendar. So feel free to pull that up and follow along there as we talk. And just to sort of preface this presentation and the next one, this is obviously part of our sort of year-long effort to revise the project selection criteria for the TIP. And this process began way back last fall and will continue throughout the summer. And I'll get a little bit more into the timeline of what that looks like after today at the end of my presentation. So this is the ground that I'm hoping to cover with you all today for this presentation. I'll start out with some of the goals that we have for this conversation, and then we'll also introduce some notes to sort of frame what we're talking about and why. I'll talk about some of the feedback that we've received specific to the safety criteria from both you all and from public outreach. I will then get into the proposed changes that we are going to discuss on the current criteria before, again, coming to some of those next steps in the timeline. So starting with the goals for today. So the goals are really threefold, at least for this presentation. First is for you all to provide feedback on the general direction of the safety criteria. Are we on the right track with the changes that we're proposing? Second, and sort of complementary to that, are there things that we're missing or things that you'd like us to explore further within the safety goal area? And then finally, number three, Betsy Harvey will have a sort of companion presentation to my presentation on safety, where she'll talk about the overlay of equity criteria on top of the safety criteria. So that will come immediately after this. And now to frame the conversation a little bit. So when we started this process back in the fall, we set 5 guiding principles to act as a check on this work and sort of make sure that we're on the right track. To the extent possible, the new TIP criteria should accomplish these 5 things. They should be manageable to implement. They should make use of the best available data and methods that we have at our disposal. They should sort of create balance across investment programs and address some of the existing imbalances that we have in today's criteria. They should be both realistic and aspirational, so obviously attainable for the projects that we will realistically see, but also hopefully encouraging projects to think in new ways and think beyond sort of the baseline. And then finally, we obviously want our finished product to be clear to project proponents and other stakeholders, especially to members of the public. Something we've got feedback a lot on in the past is that the criteria can be sort of wonky and confusing and dense. And so when we get to the end product here, we certainly want to do our best to communicate it in a clear way to make legible for folks how we're considering projects. So a couple of other notes to frame the conversation. First, point values will be refined at a later date in a more holistic way. So we're obviously going through the changes to the criteria in sort of piecemeal fashion. We started back in February talking about the clean air and sustainable communities criteria. And then today we're covering safety and economic vitality. So we have some proposed point values along with each criterion that we'll be discussing, but those are very much subject to change. That's just sort of a starting point. And then once we have a full picture of all the changes and I've gotten feedback from you all, then we can refine those point values as we go. Along those lines, these changes are obviously subject to continued feedback. We very much want this to be a conversation today to get a sense of whether or not we're heading in the right direction and other things you'd like us to consider. And then finally, Specific to the safety presentation, there will be some differences in how we score projects across investment programs. So this is something we've been talking about on and off for several months now, and that will really come into the picture here today. So moving into the sort of overview of our current point allocation. So this is how our scoring system breaks down today across our 6 goal areas. And safety is obviously what we're talking about in this presentation, with 30 possible points out of a total of 134. Safety represents 22% of all possible points and is our largest goal area by point value. So I do want to highlight some of the objectives for safety that came out of the LRTP process last year when Destination 2040 was endorsed by this body last August. So there were 3 objectives that were established for safety in the LRTP. The first is to reduce the number and severity of crashes and safety incidents for all modes. Second is to reduce serious injuries and fatalities from transportation. And third is to make investments and support initiatives that help protect transportation customers, employees, and the public from safety and security threats. This is sort of a current breakdown of our criteria as they stand today. And again, this is detailed in the companion document that we have posted on the website. But you can see here that we have 6 different safety criteria, and that on the left-hand side and then on the right-hand side those are their corresponding point values. You can see right now that we approach safety in a fairly even-handed way. 5 points for each criterion, with no real distinguishing between sort of priorities across criteria. We can sort of talk about as we go, whether or not that approach makes sense, and we obviously have some proposals on that front. But this is really our starting point. So we're taking into account crash severity through equivalent property damage only, which I'll talk more about in a minute. We also look at crash rates, taking into account the volume of travelers on a given corridor or intersection. We also look at safety issues as they relate specifically to trucks, bicycles, and pedestrians. So those 3 criteria in the middle there. And then towards the bottom, we also look at the extent to which any project mitigates safety issues around railroad crossings. So this is our starting point, and we'll talk about how this might change as we go. Before we get into the changes, I do want to talk about some of the feedback that we've received on these existing criteria, which have certainly guided the changes that we're proposing. This sort of feels like ages ago at this point, but we did do quite a bit of outreach around the TIP criteria changes back in the fall and winter, 5 to 7 months ago. And I do want to take a few minutes to go through that with all of you. And I'll start with the feedback that we heard from this board, and focusing here specifically on the safety specific feedback. So through the survey that we sent out last December, we heard from you that the more quantitative safety criteria are helpful because they have concrete values that equate to different scores, but that technical terms, things like EPDO and even crash rates, would benefit from being better defined in some of our criteria materials. We also heard that the scoring on the effectiveness of safety countermeasures from low effectiveness to high effectiveness needs to be better defined, as it's not really clear what sorts of changes warrant certain scores. So that's something that we are actively thinking about as well. We also held an in-person criteria focus group with several MPO members. This is also back in December. At that meeting, several of you mentioned that safety is the highest consideration when selecting TIP projects. And that reflects in the way that we award it more points than any other scoring area in the current criteria. We also heard about the interplay between safety and multimodalism, specifically that increasing safety for one mode, like people walking, can help promote safety for other modes, such as people biking or driving. We also heard that safety is key if projects are going to promote mode shifts. from people driving to people taking alternative modes of transportation. Obviously, people need to feel safe taking those alternative modes and won't, sort of make that shift without that base level of safety. Moving now to some of the other feedback that we've received on the safety criteria. The Advisory Council responded to a survey highlighting promoting pedestrian safety as the most important goal for transportation in the region, and asked that in evaluating safety measures, the scoring should strongly correspond to the degree of improvements being made. From the Livable Streets Alliance, we heard a desire to reduce the scoring focus on property damage only crashes in favor of crashes that result in injuries or fatalities. So really focusing on those most severe instances. And from the Conservation Law Foundation, this was more sort of a general piece of feedback, but we heard a desire from them to really focus our resources on the places with the most urgent needs. And so, safety is one place to very directly think about that. And then finally, through our technical assistance work with Transportation for America, they recommended that we look for opportunities throughout our scoring rubric to reduce the overall number of criteria and simplify and focus our criteria wherever possible. So that's been sort of an overarching approach as we've thought through each goal area. So also in November and December, we hosted 6 focus groups with over 100 total attendees. In those conversations, we heard that there are significant disparities in the importance of addressing safety across modes. So improving safety for trucks and cars came in pretty low on the priority list, while improving bicycle safety landed in the middle. Improving pedestrian safety was a top concern for many, with nearly 25% of participants in these focus groups, including pedestrian safety in their top 3 priorities for MPO action in the region. So we also, as part of our outreach, surveyed 461 members of the public last fall and got similar results to the focus groups. In the survey, however, bicycle safety rose higher on the list, and pedestrian safety emerged as the top concern, with more than half of respondents including this in their top 5 goals for improving transportation in the region. So we also got hundreds of responses to the open-ended questions in the survey, which we were very heartened by and excited by. More than half of survey takers took the time to fill in the open-ended portions where they could just share some of their input in a more general way. So when we asked respondents to explain why they put things as their highest priorities in more detail, these are some of the responses that we got. So first, we heard a lot of general commentary on the lack of safety present in our current transportation system, pointing to things just like the general complexity of traveling in Boston and how that can lead to safety issues. We also heard several comments that noted that people walking are really the core of our transportation system in many ways, and that enhancing safety for people walking empowers residents and promotes equity. Finally, we heard, much like the feedback from this body, that promoting safety for non-auto users, like people biking, can promote safety for other modes as well. So I'm going to dive into the key changes we're proposing now. As I do that, I'm going to follow the same approach that we used when discussing the Clean Air and Sustainable Communities criteria back in February. So I will sort of step through the criteria one by one, and after each one, I'll stop and we can have a short discussion, and I can get your response to that proposal before moving on to the next one. This is an effort to sort of keep the conversation a little bit more focused and a little bit more manageable, as there are a lot of details here, and so I don't want the details to get lost in the shuffle. So at the end of the presentation, we'll also have time for any final questions on the material that I cover before I turn it over to Betsy to discuss the equity scoring for safety. So if any questions don't get addressed as we go through sort of step by step, you can always save them to the end. So before we get into the actual changes here, And I apologize for some of the wonky formatting here. We had a file transfer issue in getting this set up, but yeah, so apologies for that. But these are some of the key takeaways for the changes to the criteria, which will be the roadmap for the next several slides. On the left, you see the criteria that we'll be discussing, and then on the right, you can see the general approach taken for each one. So many of these look similar to what I showed you several slides ago. So beginning with EPDO, or crash severity value, we're really just focusing on updating the scoring scale to reflect new EPDO values that have been created by MassDOT, and I'll get to that in more detail here in a sec. On crash rates, we're really looking to focus not so much on crashes generally, but specifically on injury and fatality crashes. And again, I'll get into more detail on that in a second. On truck safety, we're keeping the approach generally the same, but are proposing to reallocate some of the bonus points to more multimodal safety improvements, which still include trucks. And then for bicycle and pedestrian safety, this is where we get into really distinguishing between roadway projects and bicycle and pedestrian projects. So you'll see how we handle that here in a minute. For improving safety at an at-grade railroad crossing, which is our current criterion here, we are going to sort of reimagine this criterion to recognize more multimodal safety improvements. So we'll still include railroad crossings, but we'll also include some other things that weren't previously recognized in the same way. And then finally, for our transit modernization program, we will propose some new criteria that address documented safety issues broadly. So that's sort of the roadmap for the next several slides. And with that, we will get into it here. So beginning with crash severity value, which is equivalent property damage only. As the name implies, this criterion is really about measuring the severity of crashes. To calculate EPDO, individual crashes are awarded points based on their severity, with crashes that result in property damage only, things like fender benders, scoring the lowest, and crashes that result in injuries or fatalities, scoring much higher. On the left, you can see the current scale we use to score this criterion. And we are proposing to keep the basic approach to this criterion the same, but to really implement two changes. And you can see the proposal here on the right-hand side of the table. So the first change is really to update the EPDO calculation to match MassDOT's new approach, which awards 1 EPDO point for property damage only crashes and 21 points for any crashes that result in injuries or fatalities. So this new scale, which MassDOT implemented last year, shifts the focus to the most severe crashes, as injury crashes and fatal crashes under the previous scale received just 5 points and 10 points respectively. So this new scale really, again, pushes some of those point values to the more severe crashes, and really aligns with the federal safety performance measures, which place significant emphasis on crashes that lead to injuries and fatalities. The second change here is to separate out bicycle and pedestrian projects, as EPDO values for these projects tend to be much lower, especially with off-street, off-street like rail trail type projects. So that means that complete streets, intersection improvements, and major infrastructure projects would be scored on one scale, and then bicycle and pedestrian projects would be scored also on EPDO, but on a different scale. So in the coming weeks, we will continue to analyze the EPDO values for past TIP projects that will help us develop these new scales. So they are very much in the works, but this is sort of the general approach here. And with that, I can pause for a sec and see if anyone has any questions or comments on crash severity before I move on to the next scale here.
I'm seeing a comment from Tom.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, Matt. Thanks for this. So I understand the emphasis is going to be on injuries. What did you say that the point difference, the new point difference would be for property crashes versus injuries? Or did you say that?
Yeah. So the differences here are in the MassDOT scale, which calculates sort of the EPDO value. So under both the old and the new scale, property damage only crashes are worth 1 point. But the big change is to how injury and fatality crashes are tallied. So under the old scale, injury crashes were 5 points and fatality crashes were 10 points. But under the new scale, both injury and fatality crashes are worth 21 points. And so it really boosts sort of relative.
21 points. So here's my question. So let's say that we have an intersection that has 20 property crashes, okay? And that's 20 points, right? This probably might indicate there's a problem there. It's a property. What I'm suggesting is that a property crash may be a proxy for something just waiting to happen. So we have one personal injury crash, one, and that's worth 21 points. So I guess what I'm saying is, there's the possibility that there's the odd crash, and if there's one crash, for example, in an intersection that has no personal injury crashes, does the MPO then look at the operating characteristics? In other words, was the person driving 80 miles an hour in a 30-mile zone? And that sort of screws everything up, doesn't it? I guess what I'm saying is the problem I have here with that is an intersection that has 20 fender bender crashes loses out to an intersection that has one physical injury crash. And I'm not saying that the physical injury crash shouldn't be addressed. It's just that if there's a few or one or two, then it might suggest that there's personal liability at fault here versus some sort of geometric defect or traffic signal defects. That's my comment. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Those are all really good points. And I would definitely be interested to hear, other member feedback on that same sort of point here. And I just will emphasize that, this is the methodology that MassDOT is now using. And so the updating our criteria would basically just, have us reflect that same methodology. We don't have to make that change, and as Tom, thank you for pointing out, there's sort of pros and cons to that approach. So if other folks have feedback on that point, I'm definitely, we'd definitely love to hear more.
Sheila?
Thank you. Thanks, Matt, for this. I think this is a challenging, it's a challenging balance. I actually, I wasn't going to say this, but Mr. Katz brings up a good point in that an outlier of a crazy driver can sort of then upset the scoring. So I agree with his point. My other kind of comment is I like very much that we're separating out bike and pedestrian projects so that they kind of get balanced with major infrastructure and intersection and complete streets projects. But I was wondering, and I don't know how we can do this, so I don't have a solution. And I don't even know if it's a problem, but I wonder, my understanding of the crash rates and the crash rate severity those are crashes that involve a vehicle. And so I'm thinking that in particular complete streets, we're now taking out pedestrian and bicycle sort of safety. They get knocked down a little bit in the complete streets projects. I'm not sure I'm making sense, but I'm thinking if there's a bicycle, if there's an intersection, we'll say, or a complete street that has a large amount of pedestrian and bicycle crashes, those are all not counted then, if I'm understanding correctly. And I'm not sure it's a real concern, but I'm wondering if that would upset the balance a little bit.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So, the crash data that we use is, the MassDOT, generated crash data for this. We, use it here for the region. So it does require that, the crash be reported. So, we do lose out on instances where there may be like a more minor collision between, let's say, a car and a pedestrian or a car and a cyclist. Like if that crash isn't reported, then we don't really have the ability to know about it. But if the crash is reported, even if it's, involving a bicyclist or a pedestrian, then it would show up in the data. So, but we do, sort of have to rely on, local and state police to sort of actually file the reports and report back on that data, which is, certainly a limiting factor because practices on that vary by municipality and, and again, they do rely on folks to actually, if something happens, to actually, call emergency services and report it. But if there is a crash that involves, let's say, like a car and a bicyclist, then that would show up in the data.
Okay, great, thank you. But it would a bicyclist, a non-car crash in an intersection, does that show up at all? Or is that not recorded? I mean, I know it has to be reported, but.
Yeah, I believe if it's reported, then it would show up. But yeah, I don't have a good sense in the data of, how often, a bicyclist crash that doesn't involve a car or a truck or something gets reported. Yeah, I don't, off the top of my head, I can look into that more.
No, I think it's all right. I don't know. I don't really know if it's an issue or not, but thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Len?
Thank you, Matt. And so I have a couple questions. One's based on what Tom brought up. So in the database for crashes, is there any annotation for these odd circumstances where an intersection that has pretty much only property values, then when there is a fatality, is there some way that that database is annotated so that it is defined or better described so we have a sense of whether it is a really weird outlier or whether it's maybe the first of something that is an indicator of a possible trend?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the data that we use sort of just breaks down locations by type of crashes. So it would be, property damage only crashes, injury crashes, fatal crashes, and there are sort of different classifications for the types of injury crashes. But we really just sort of get a tally of those. So there isn't more sort of annotative evidence about what was going on with individual crashes, which, gets back to Tom's point about, one errant driver can sort of skew the data. But there isn't, at this point, like we don't have a practical way to distinguish, driver error from, let's say like going double the speed limit or something like that. Something that's like way out of left fields versus like, like a crash that resulted from poor roadway geometry or poor sight lines or, some other sort of very, fixable thing that we would see in a project.
Gotcha. And so now this question is going to be familiar, and if it's too early for it at the wrong time, just let me know. See, so I've always wondered about the distribution of the EPDO values, and so is that something we're going to look at in order to determine how we give points, to the various bins?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we come back and address these criteria in a more sort of once we have a full picture of everything and we continue to work on developing that scale, we'll come back to this question of, how do we want to set certain thresholds for,
Right.
EPDO values. And that could be one way to sort of mitigate, some of these outlier issues by perhaps, balancing out some of that in the way that we distribute points across EPDO values.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if that would take care of the outlier issue, but really what I'm getting at is that if we have the EPDO values that are higher than 300, a lot of them, then we might want to change our scale so that we can really focus on those areas that have high impact crashes. And so I'm a little bit concerned about the linear scale. So that's all, but you've heard that from me. I just wanted to say this context and understand when we'd have a chance to chime in on that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Len.
Ben Muller, did you have something to chime in on this subject?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that the sort of 21 scale for a injury crash comes from the Highway Safety Manual produced by AASHTO. Well, it's sort of an approximation. They have a different scale for different types of injuries that sort of ranges from, I think, 11 to 29. So that was sort of our approach at MassDOT in updating our guidance from weighting these as 10 to 21.
So I know that Steve, this is Eric Barassa at MAPC. I know Steve has left the meeting, so I've taken over chairing it now. So I can call on people, Matt. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eric.
So I think Len, just had a question. Len, keep your hand up if you have another one, but let me go to Daniel.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Eric. Daniel Amstutz, town of Arlington. Tom's question sort of precipitated a couple of others for me, or response or follow-up. And I think Ben sort of got it. The second question I was going to ask, which was about understanding whether the injuries are the way that you characterized it, Matt, or it seemed like any type of injury or fatality is one score, and I was wondering if there was I thought it would make sense to have that more of as a sliding scale, where obviously the fatality is the highest, but a possible injury or something that is not debilitating is sort of lower. It's higher than a property damage, but lower than a fatality, right? So it doesn't make sense to me that you would score all of the injuries or fatalities the same way. And then to Tom's point about the number of crashes versus sort of one isolated incident. So I certainly appreciate that there is, if you have a lot of crashes, if the number of crashes is high, that certainly could display a pattern. But is that, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that sort of mitigated by the crash rate criteria, where you would actually, or not mitigated, but sort of that is factored in as part of the crash rate? Is that correct?
Yeah, so EPDO does not take into account vehicle volume, whereas crash rate does, and so crash rate does help to sort of even things out, and distinguish between sort of higher volume and lower volume facilities. Yeah, and I will say, this sort of builds on some of the points that have been raised here, but specifically to Len's point with how we set the point values relative to the scale. The scale on the left is our current one, and that doesn't reflect the new point values for EPDO. But a scale like this, even if we had just like one sort of outlier 21-point crash in an intersection, let's say, that would still put you at 1 point here, and so it's not boosting that project from 0 points to 5 points or something. Like we can be sort of thoughtful in how we set the scale, so that even if there are 1 or maybe 2 or 3, sort of more outlier types of crashes, those won't drastically swing our score. Yeah, so just wanted to add that in.
Okay, thanks.
So, Jay Monty.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I've been trying to wrap my head around this and removing the property damage and boosting the injury score. And I was kind of tipped off at the beginning that I saw a couple of the pedestrian advocacy groups were very much in favor of this. And I'm trying to think as to why that was, but I think it makes sense now to me. And I think maybe this gets to Sheila's concern about, complete streets and pedestrian and cyclists. If you think about it, I mean, any accident involving a cyclist or pedestrian is pretty likely to involve at least an injury. The vehicle speed may be low. It may be the same conditions that a vehicle and vehicle collision might only result in property damage are very likely to create a injury or fatality for a cyclist or a pedestrian. And so I think that's the reasoning. I think I agree with this, that you really, if you're concerned about complete streets, concerned about pedestrian and bike safety, that you put such a high weight on injury accidents and even lump them with fatalities, because that's going to parse out the intersections that may not seem all that dangerous from a vehicular perspective, but perhaps from a pedestrian and cycling perspective, they're actually really an accident waiting to happen, if not already haven't had a pretty bad accident to date. So I think that's the reasoning behind it. I'm not certain if anybody else wants to comment on that, but I think I agree with it. I think that's the direction to go. I don't know. I'm curious to hear other comments on that.
Yeah, I would just say, and Ben Muller can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that that's sort of the intent of this, is that as we get to more multimodal facilities, really recognizing where those problem areas are, especially in like a complete streets context, and this helps sort of it makes those instances rise to the top a little bit more quickly.
Okay. Laura Gilmore.
Hi there. Matt, I think this is really helpful. And I know I gave you some comments early on in the process about, just trying to make sure that all modes were accounted in various parts of the scoring. I think you've done a great job of accommodating that. I just wanted to make one comment about the freight scores, since I know that's something that you probably did not get a lot of comments on through a public process. What I'd like to suggest is that you also consider truck routes as part of the safety scoring. I think what's relevant there is that if there is an existing truck route or an existing designation through the critical urban freight corridors, which this MPO designated, that is then if you're doing a project on those routes, it's trying to keep trucks on those routes and off of other routes where there may be more impact on local traffic or on bicycle and pedestrians. So I wanted to throw that out as something that could be quantifiable, that might be something you could consider adding to the freight piece.
Okay. Actually, just a sort of clarifying question. So do you mean adding something about, critical urban freight corridors or truck routes in the actual safety criteria somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, just a yes, no is a project. If there is a project that's relevant to freight, which, I don't think comes up all that frequently, but does come up, I would just suggest that it's not entirely about the criteria that you have might be supplemented by also having a yes, no, is this project on a critical urban freight corridor or other truck route, designated truck route.
Cool, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just, I guess, some clarifying questions about, doing research on crashes for this process. Are you also, looking at EMS data? And I know that maybe a year ago I had connected Michelle Scott and myself with our Vision Zero manager in the city of Austin. We have new data that we're trying to get better at reporting and putting up on our website as well that combines both, kind of police reports and EMS data to define and clarify crash locations by all modes. So just, I guess, question as to whether or not you're kind of cross-referencing with EMS data and or the city's sort of Vision Zero data that we've compiled and or other municipalities that I think are doing a much better job of through other similar Vision Zero efforts at trying to get the data out there and clarified and consolidated. So just, I guess those are a couple questions as to how what sources you're using to try to define crashes for locations.
Yeah, it's a great sort of set of questions. Off the top of my head, I don't know if the EMS data is included in the data set that we get typically from MassDOT. I don't know if that's like sort of an established relationship, like if Boston EMS is relaying that, to the state and then, that eventually comes back to us. But that's something I can look into more and, certainly follow up with you on if I, run into any questions, but I appreciate the heads up on that and we can definitely look into it.
Okay, so I don't see any other members with their hands up, so I'm going to go to Pat Brown.
Okay, yes. So I'm unmuted? Okay.
Yes, you are, Pat.
Okay, so the one thing I wanted to ask about is, I came in late, so if this has already been done, just stop me. But you're looking at different EPDO values for bicycle and pedestrian projects. And I know that I have followed a north-south bicycle trail where EPDO values were given for intersections in the town that weren't actually on the route. And I just wanted to just ask, when you do this, I'm sure that, getting people off the roads and on the trail is a priority and a good idea, but that there be some kind of, explanation of, okay, if there was a crash, it was within 1/10 of a mile or 1/2 a mile or 3 miles of the actual right-of-way. Because it's just, when the stuff that I looked at, it was just not clear to me what the connection was.
Yeah, it's a great point and a great comment. I really appreciate that. That's definitely something that we are looking into, sort of how to focus those, crashes around, actual connections to, let's say, like an off-road bike path, like a rail trail. Obviously there are plenty of instances where a rail trail runs adjacent to a neighborhood or a commercial corridor, but doesn't actually connect to it. At least maybe not right in that area. And if a crash happens, 100 yards away on a parallel corridor, that may not really impact the safety implications of the project. And so we are looking into ways to make that more focused. And hopefully that is part of the final criterion here. So thank you for the comment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Matt, do you want to move on to the next?
Eric, actually, I apologize. Frank Tramontosi had previously tried to make a comment during agenda item 10, and I just was wondering if we could take him now.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. So Frank, I'm going to unmute you right now. I'm going to try you on. Let's try this. Frank, you hear me? Frank, you hear me?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Great. Sounded good.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Frank Tramontosi representing Mayor Tom Koch, City of Quincy. First, I need to make you aware of a couple of issues that you may not be aware of and probably affecting others. Today's meeting has been very frustrating for me. I've tried to raise my hand and I'm blocked. I can't raise my hand. I've tried to comment in the chat room and I'm blocked. When I do get to put something in the chat room, it's delayed. Matt Archer and I did a test, and it's been delayed. It's delayed quite a considerable amount of time before I get it, or before he or someone else can get a message from me. I was able to get a couple of messages through with the chat room, but typing it in there, there is a problem with trying to type a full message in there. I've had trouble, so maybe others are having the same type of trouble that I have. This is the first time I've had this type of trouble. I've tried calling by phone. I was told I was muted by the host and cannot unmute myself. I'm on the phone now. I talked to Matt, and that's how I'm able to speak to you. I'm very frustrated with the way this Zoom meeting has gone. I haven't had this problem with any other Zoom meetings that I've participated in. And I wanted to ask a question about a Quincy project. For all the meetings, the handouts, and discussions on the tip, Quincy's C Street project has been programmed on the tip for federal fiscal year 2022. Today is the first time I've seen a handout with the Quincy C Street project moved from federal fiscal year 2022 to federal fiscal year 2023. And as Quincy's MPO rep, how could this happen without my knowledge, without contacting me? How can this be done unilaterally when I have not known anything about it? I could have rallied the legislative delegation to send in comments, but all along this time, I thought the project was moving along the schedule until this meeting. And if you're going to do something like this to a municipality, don't you think it would be appropriate to discuss this action with the affected municipality representative? That's my comment. It's too late now to do anything about it. I know it's been released for public comment, but I couldn't even get in my words before you actually voted on this. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Matt, could you just comment about, and Frank, staff hears the frustrations about the Zoom call, and I'm sure they will look into just what have been the challenges. I also tried to put something into the chat earlier, and I was not able to do that. So I echo that as well. So maybe that is something staff can look into more. And I don't know why you couldn't raise your hand, but we'll look into that. But then Matt, could you speak to the Quincy C Street project and did it indeed move from fiscal year 22 to 23 and when that was posted?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I appreciate the chance to comment on this. And my apologies to Mr. Tramontosi. Certainly don't mean to leave anyone out of this process. I'm looking at this sort of on the fly here in the middle of, obviously some other presentations. And my records show that the C Street projects both started and ended this tip cycle in fiscal 2023. I could take some more time after this meeting and look into if there was some sort of mistake along the way, or if this, project moved in a prior fiscal year and maybe it wasn't communicated then. But the final documentation that I have pulled up right now shows that Quincy was programmed in 2023 last year and it remains in 2023 this year. But again, I can look into it more after this call or after this meeting and see if I'm missing something here. I do want to apologize again. Certainly my intention is never to not communicate something or to leave something out with the municipality. And so if that is the case, then we can talk more about that.
So you can talk to Frank kind of offline. Frank, is that good for now?
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I think it was so important for you to understand that the frustration with Zoom may not only be experienced by myself, but by others.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, Matt, for looking into that. Thank you, Frank, for finally your diligence in getting in. And like I said, staff will look at into the process. Okay. So Matt, do you want to go back now to the safety criteria?
Absolutely. Yeah, give me just a sec, sort of getting resituated here. Thanks everyone for your patience. Okay. Yeah, so we'll move now to crash rates. The approach here may change based on the commentary that we just heard on the last one, so feel free to weigh in. So crash rate calculates the incidence of all crashes per million vehicle miles traveled on corridors or per million entering vehicles for intersections. There are also differences in the current scoring scales by whether or not an intersection is signalized and the type of corridor, such as a highway versus a principal arterial. The measures there are different. So the proposal for this criterion is to do two things. One is to remove property damage only crashes from the overall rate to focus the criterion on the most severe crashes, which are those resulting in injuries or fatalities. Again, this sort of aligns with the changes in methodology for the EPDO value, as well as with the federal performance measures that focus really on injuries and fatalities as sort of the primary goal. And again, we heard a lot of outreach or feedback and outreach that we should really be trying to concentrate our resources in places where the most severe problems exist. The second change is to no longer score bicycle and pedestrian projects for this criterion and to reallocate those points for those projects to other safety scoring areas, which we'll come to here in a minute. This is largely because crash rates focus on auto volumes, which is sort of tangential to the safety improvements that bicycle and pedestrian projects can typically make in a given area. We don't really have good data in most places on bicycle and pedestrian volumes, and so they're not a meaningful part of that volume calculation. As we talked about earlier, in response to some of the questions, crash rates really takes into account volume again, whereas EPO does not. So they both sort of remain as different but complementary measures. And then like EPDO, we're looking at historical tip data as well as the data sets available to us to reevaluate the actual point scale here. So I'm happy to take feedback on this. And if there is any,
Okay, any questions? Sorry. On this one? I'm not seeing any. So Matt, why don't you go on to the next one?
So moving now to truck-related safety issues. So this criterion awards points for projects that implement meaningful truck safety countermeasures. This takes into account the severity of the existing safety issues in a project area, as well as truck volumes, and then obviously, the extent to which the project actually mitigates those existing safety issues. The proposal is to keep the general approach the same for this criterion, but to sort of clarify the methodology to better communicate how this criterion is scored, which is sort of in response to some of the feedback that we heard from this body and others, that sort of, there's a need to distinguish between how we consider something low, a low degree of improvement versus a high degree of improvement. So that's something that we will continue to work on the methodology to make more specific. The one change that we're really proposing here outside of those clarifications is to remove the bonus points from this criteria, which recognize when truck-specific countermeasures were implemented at a crash cluster and reallocate these to another criterion, which we'll come back to here in a few minutes. And hopefully this is a positive change that sort of still considers trucks and truck-related safety issues, but puts them more in context of other safety improvements that are not just truck-specific, but are more multimodal. So that's what I have here. And I guess I should clarify that, we're also not going to be scoring, we're not proposing to score bicycle and pedestrian projects with this metric, just given that, most bike ped projects don't really interact with the sorts of, truck-related safety improvements that projects will be making.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I see a question from Jay Monty.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thanks, Matt. So could you just clarify what truck safety countermeasures look like? So, because there's a couple ways you could look at this, right? It could be, is it reducing all accidents involving a truck? Is it reducing, are they countermeasures to protect pedestrians, cyclists, small vehicle, people who will be most impacted by a truck accident? I guess I'll give some examples of like what those are.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this really, addresses places where there are, truck involved crashes. So that could be, truck crashes with other trucks, with cars, with bicyclists or pedestrians. So it's really just whenever there's a truck involved crash, and, that shows up. And so the, part of the improvements that we want to make to this is really specifying the sorts of, things that, the sorts of improvements that would, mitigate truck related incidents. And the, the main one that gets referenced in a lot of project proposals is, fixing things like roadway geometry to allow for better truck turning movements. A lot of trucking happen when a truck is attempting to turn at a tight intersection, and it might be hopping the curb or otherwise endangering people in the vicinity because of a lack of space. And so we do see a lot of projects that are making specific investments to account for truck volumes. And there might even be, I think the Beecham Street project in Everett is a good example of one where, in order to promote safety for all the users, the bicyclists and pedestrians are sort of moved to an off-street facility that, limits their interaction directly with what is a corridor that experiences a lot of truck traffic. And so those sorts of improvements could also be, taken into account because that sort of promotes safety for everyone.
So, I mean, you brought up a good point, which is, geometry is often a big factor in this. And, we see, certainly in Everett, we see a lot of, I'll say that their property accidents, right, involving trucks that can't make turns. They climb the sidewalk or they, things like that. The flip side of that is when you make the geometry more, comfortable for a truck, you're in many times, impacting the safety for other users in other ways. If you increase crossing distances, if you increase vehicle speeds, because now the radius, the curvature is now larger. And I just don't know how it's always a conflict. It's nothing new. I'm curious how this, and maybe it just comes down to a project by project, judgment call. But I want to make sure that when we say truck safety, that we're not looking at something and say, hey, we know this intersection is a little too tight, so we're going to widen it. But we've now impacted safety in other ways because we've increased, vehicle speeds, and we've increased, pedestrian crossing distances and things like that. This may be not the right moment to discuss that, but I just want to make that, point.
Yeah, it's a good point, and definitely sort of continue to flesh out and work on as we develop the more fine-grained methodology for this. Obviously we don't want we do want to promote truck safety and the ability for trucks to move about, the region, but we don't want to do it at the expense of, the direct expense of other users. And so you're right, that's very much about striking a balance. And so I think, questions on this are certainly things that we'll continue to come back to as we flesh out the methodology. And we'll get to some other measures later in this discussion about ways to hopefully mitigate some of those issues.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Ken Miller.
Thank you, Eric. Just to follow up on what Jay brought up, yes, improvements that will be helpful for some vehicle types or modes may be detrimental to others. I have a general question about the criteria, and that is, I think it makes sense to have the ability to give folks negative scores for things that are detrimental, particularly for safety, but maybe for some of the other criteria too. So I note that that is not something that you may have that, I think, in some of the criteria. I think maybe it was air quality at one point, but I think for many of the criteria, you should have the ability to take away points from things that are detrimental, as opposed to, so for example, does not implement truck safety, it gets a 0, but I think you should be able to go negative, let's put it that way, in general.
Thank you, Ken. Laura Gilmore.
Hey there. So this is where I was suggesting that I think this reference to truck routes could be helpful. And I'm thinking in light of Jay's comment that this could help to address a little bit of it. You know, I fully understand that there's a dynamic interplay between modes here, and I do think there are situations where a freight project, you know, might get points in the freight category, but there might also be improvements that separate other modes that then, you know, also are supportive of, you know, bicycle safety, which helps truck safety. I just would suggest that, you know, I think if we're thinking about the context of where there are established truck facilities and where we are improving or completing a network there, that might help to mitigate some of the comments that Jay was making, because I don't think you'd want to be just looking at truck safety in a vacuum. You would want to be looking at it in the places where it makes the most sense for a last mile connection.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Len Diggins.
Hi, Matt. Thanks. I'm just going to ask just a couple of questions, more so out of curiosity rather than really pushing a point of view. But you'll kind of see where I'm headed with this. So, do we have a sense of the distribution of truck accidents and the severity of them? I'm sure the data is recorded somewhere, but I'm trying to understand the extent to which that's taken into account, once again, with determining the scale that we're going to give towards the effectiveness. Because if we're having a lot of truck crashes, so it's not only the number of truck crashes, but that, you know, they have a big impact either on just the physical costs or lives being taken. We might want to try to adjust our scales.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and definitely something we can look into more to get a better sense of, you know, if there are certain hotspots or other instances where truck crashes are particularly high. So I can sort of do some more research on that and perhaps follow up with you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Len. I don't see any other hands raised. So do you want to move on?
Sure. Moving now to improving bicycle and pedestrian safety. And I apologize again about the formatting. But give me just a second. Sorry. So this page here is actually sort of two different existing criteria: improving bicycle safety and improving pedestrian safety. I'm talking about them at the same time here because the approach is the same for both criteria. So these criteria were points for addressing bicycle and pedestrian safety issues, with points scaled based on the severity of the current deficiencies and the extent to which the project addresses them. The approach for these criteria will remain much the same, but with some added clarification for what sorts of improvements count for which point values. So much like we just discussed with the truck criterion, you know, really focusing on that methodology to make clear sort of what we're looking for and how many points that adds up to. So we are proposing sort of two changes here. One is to alter the bonus point structure to award an extra bonus point for projects that improve bicycle and pedestrian safety at multiple all-mode crash clusters. So formally, if you were at an all mode crash cluster, you could get 1 bonus point. And if you were at a bicycle pedestrian specific crash cluster, you could get 2. But this is sort of recognizing that some projects improve safety at multiple all mode clusters. And so, you know, that's certainly a sort of higher level of existing issue. And so we would award an extra bonus point for addressing that. The second change here is that we are proposing to separate out the bicycle and pedestrian projects from the complete streets, major infrastructure, and intersection improvement projects in recognition that these criteria, you know, improving bicycle and pedestrian safety, are really sort of like the most critical for bicycle and pedestrian projects, as you can imagine. So for bicycle and pedestrian specific projects, the point scale would essentially just be higher for these 2 criteria. You know, sort of really weighting those issues more heavily. And again, the exact point values are certainly open for discussion, but this is just sort of to communicate that you know, these criteria would be the bulk of the points available to bicycle and pedestrian projects in the safety category. And that's all I've got here. So happy to take comments.
I see a question from Len.
I just wanted to express how happy I am to see that relatively non-linear scale. You know that I've been pushing for that, so it's so good to see it in that category. Thank you, Matt.
Absolutely. Thanks, Len.
Okay, I don't see any other. So do you want to move on? Thank you.
Definitely. All right. Moving now to improving safety or removing an at-grade railroad crossing, which is you know, one of our current criteria here. So as its name implies, this criterion awards points for projects that significantly improve safety or completely remove a street level railroad crossing. So because this criterion applies to so few projects, we don't see a ton of projects that, you know, directly address railroad crossings. Our proposal is to reimagine this scoring area to be more inclusive of the other changes projects can make to improve safety. For that reason, we're renaming the criterion Improve Safety for All Users. This new criterion is proposed to include improvements to railroad crossings, so just like the existing criterion, but will additionally award points for making improvements to traffic signals, improving safety through changes to roadway geometry, which we discussed a little bit earlier, and adding traffic calming features. So this new criterion really sort of will now include the traffic signal points that were formerly included in the system preservation category. As you know, changes to signals tend to be really much more focused around safety than on pure system preservation goals. We don't, you know, necessarily replace traffic signals just for the sake of replacing them. It's usually to address, you know, a safety or visibility issue in an area. And so by moving those points from system preservation into this criterion here in safety, really recognizes sort of the thrust of why those signal improvements are being made. And, you know, again, we're also adding some things that we don't currently explicitly recognize, but want to, things like roadway geometry improvements and traffic calming features. And again, you know, this is sort of an effort to recognize that, as we discussed in the truck criterion, you know, there are ways to improve safety sort of across modes. And, you know, even if you're, you know, sort of improving safety for trucks, if you're also doing things like adding calming features or something of that nature, you can sort of balance that out and still promote safety for all users. And so that's where this criterion helps to measure those things. So you also notice some added bonus points here, and this is the reallocation of the truck-specific bonus points in the earlier discussion. And again, you know, sort of recognizing not just truck-related improvements, but sort of truck and other modes. And in addition to sort of reallocating the same bonus points that we had for trucks, we're also adding a third bonus point option here, where, you know, to recognize where improvements are being made at a top 200 crash location, which is a, you know, crash list that's developed by MassDOT and includes the, you know, top 200 most severe crash locations. So this new criterion is proposed to apply to complete streets, intersection improvements, and major infrastructure projects. And again, the focus on bicycle and pedestrian safety will be mostly through those other criteria that we just discussed.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. So I see a question from Dan.
Hey, Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington. So I have just a sort of hypothetical comes to mind. I think I'm maybe having a little trouble understanding the spreadsheet, but the way that, but you say like sort of not applicable to bike ped projects, but what if you had, and I guess I understand not many of these necessarily come to us, but I guess I'm just imagining a project or like a pedestrian project, like maybe a trail or something that has to cross a railroad line or a sidewalk project or something along those lines that doesn't necessarily doesn't necessarily fit into a complete streets project because it's not maybe affecting quite as much of the roadway. I'm just trying to understand, does that, it improves safety it improves safety at like a at-grade railroad crossing or something along those lines. But so how would something like that kind of fit into this if it's not, if it wouldn't be under, if you wouldn't get points or it doesn't come under a bike ped project, like scoring under that? Do you see what I mean?
Perhaps. So are you asking for bike ped projects that we would score as a bicycle pedestrian project if they're not scoring points in this criterion, but they are addressing a railroad crossing? Is that an instance where we should be thinking about using this criterion for those? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just saying, like, let's say you have a trail and it proves, I don't know, it improves safety when you're crossing. You have to cross the railroad to get there, and it improves the safety of that. But it's really specifically a bike pedestrian project. Like, it wouldn't get any points under this place. Is that? I'm just raising that as a hypothetical situation.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Like as proposed, if it's a bicycle pedestrian specific project, then it would not score points for that specific improvement. But that's something. Again, this is sort of just a proposal, and so if folks think that we should explore what this would look like, this sort of all user safety metric would look like for bicycle and pedestrian projects as well, then we can think about that more. Because I think there are some instances where we may be missing out on some of those. So yeah, I'm certainly open to exploring that if that is something you'd like us to do.
Yeah, I guess I could see you might be able to put, I don't know, you'd look at that under like the whole, the entire safety or bicycle and pedestrian safety, those metrics instead. But anyway, that's just one thought that comes to mind in terms of having some projects that aren't scored under certain criteria. So that's something that comes to mind. But understanding also that if you had this as a criteria, probably a lot of projects wouldn't necessarily get points out of this because they wouldn't apply to them. So just thinking about balancing those things. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So I don't see any other questions, any other hands raised. Do you want to move along?
Yeah, definitely. Moving now to transit modernization, which is our last criterion here. Because this program is really still in development and we may see a wide variety of potential projects through this program, our proposed approach is really a general one that puts the onus on project proponents to outline the existing safety issues that the project is addressing. So points are awarded based on the severity of the safety issue and the extent to which that issue is documented through safety reports or audits. So you can see the proposed scoring scale here. Really sort of the more well-defined and severe the existing safety issue is, the more points a project would be awarded. But still you can get points for even more minor safety issues that are being addressed, even if that's not the main focus of the project. Again, because this program is really still in development, our approach here is sort of a broad one. And as we pilot this program in the coming tip cycles, we can always take the opportunity to revisit this scoring system moving forward. But we think this is a good starting point, recognizing that we're still working with our transit agency partners to understand what works well for them and the sorts of projects that they would like to see funded through this. But this is sort of a first approach that we think could capture most things and still recognize safety improvements that are being made through transit modernization projects.
Okay, any questions on this one? I think this makes sense, having kind of an initial broad kind of qualitative approach to this. Again, we're comparing against the best transit modernization projects, so that's great. Let's see. So is that the end of your presentation on the safety?
I just have a few more quick things, but yeah. And then we can move to Betsy. There's time for, yeah. So yeah, just a couple of quick notes. We did explore some other potential scoring avenues as a part of this process. We took a look at things like expected crash calculations and crash modification factors, both of which attempt to predict the safety benefits of proposed improvements on the crash rates along a corridor or at an intersection. These approaches are both robust ways to consider the safety impacts of projects, but both require a level of specificity in project documentation and design that isn't currently feasible for a lot of projects at sort of the pre-25% design level that we typically see them. Additionally, both approaches are pretty labor intensive and are sort of too heavy of a lift given the time and staffing constraints of the existing tip scoring process. And for these reasons, we chose not to pursue these approaches at this time, but we'll certainly continue to look into these sorts of things moving forward. Briefly in next steps, got a little bit more discussion to happen today on safety. I'll turn it over to Betsy here in just a couple of minutes. And then coming up over the next couple of MPO meetings, we want to wrap up our discussion of system preservation and capacity management goal areas. And then finally, once we get into late July and beyond, we'll move into a test scoring phase where we'll, again, really sort of fine tune point values and make corrections based on test scores. And we'll do a little bit more public outreach to get a sense of how folks respond to some of our proposed changes. So with that, I can turn it over to Betsy to discuss some of the equity implications of this.
So before Betsy goes, we are going to delay the economic vitality discussion to the next MPO meeting, just because we're running out of time and we want to give that one its proper due for a good robust discussion. So Betsy's overview of the equity criterion incorporated into the safety section will be the last agenda item before members' items.
Great, thanks Eric, and thanks Matt for that detailed introduction to our proposals. As Matt mentioned, I wanted to go over some of our proposed changes to how we'd like to evaluate equity as part of our safety criteria. And this is really where we can start thinking about how we're addressing through the TIP criteria current inequities in our transportation system. I know there's been a lot of conversation in the past when we do our disparate impact analysis for a long range plan about kind of future inequities. So this is really about kind of addressing current and future, of course, potential inequities as they exist in our transportation system. So I'll start by, I can get this to advance. Sorry, I'm not used to, here we go. Okay, so I'll start by talking about the overview of our proposed equity scoring system, and then talk about the safety criteria that we'll evaluate for their equity impacts, and then show how this process would be applied to those safety criteria. I just want to first remind you how we would evaluate the safety criteria on equity populations, and this process would be the same over almost all of the goal areas. You'll remember back to March when we talked about the clean air and sustainable communities goal area and equity as part of that similar proposal, where we think this approach is going to help us meet our goals of giving all projects an opportunity to get at least some equity points, while more strongly rewarding projects that significantly benefit equity populations and penalizing those that may create harmful impacts. And so we have two parallel processes. One is evaluating the criteria in each goal area that we choose to be an equity criteria. For example, we might choose the improved pedestrian safety criteria, and we'd analyze it or evaluate it the same way that we normally do, resulting in a base score. The other process is then to identify the equity populations that are in the project area that would be affected by the project. And the outcome of this process is what we're calling an equity multiplier, which, as it sounds, it would be multiplied by the base score to get a final score for those equity criteria. So for each goal area, we want to choose a subset of those criteria to evaluate for their impacts on equity populations. And when we're selecting criteria to evaluate, we want to focus on those impacts that most directly affect equity populations. And so for safety, we would like to evaluate the crash severity value as measured by EPDO, the improved bicyclist safety criteria, and the improved pedestrian safety criteria. And we chose those criteria for a couple of reasons. One being that in the LRDP needs assessment, we found that pedestrian and bicyclist crash clusters tend to be overrepresented in communities with high shares of equity populations. And then in addition, when we did outreach for the TIP over this past winter and fall, we found that respondents really emphasized the need to address pedestrian and bicyclist safety as a way of promoting equitable mobility and improving safety in equity communities that are disproportionately affected by severe crashes. So now I want to show you how we're going to evaluate those projects. And the first step is to create what we're calling an equity index, with the idea being to combine the population of each equity demographic into one number that tells us how concentrated that population is in the project area. So the higher the index is, the more the equity populations would be affected by the project. So the index is based on the idea that each population has a different distribution characteristics in our region. You may remember this slide from my last presentation back in March. And there was interest then to see the distribution, a similar map showing the distribution of all equity populations in the area. So I'm going to briefly show you those maps so you can get an idea of how our populations are distributed. With the red areas showing a higher share of the equity population, in this case the minority population, and the yellow areas showing a lower share of that population. This map shows the low-income population. As you can see, we tend to be more concentrated in the inner core areas, as well as the north and south shore, and some spots on Metro West. People with limited English proficiency also have tend to live more in the inner core areas and in some areas in Metro West. And then we have a couple of populations that tend to be more widely distributed in our region, as you might expect. For example, the elderly population, you can see has a fairly even distribution, more so than the other populations you've seen. Same with the youth population. And people with disability is also more widely distributed a little bit more. So based on that information, I want to show you how we create the index using the minority population as an example. So this chart shows the distribution of the minority population, and it will look different for each of the 6 populations. The y-axis shows the number of transportation analysis zones, and the x-axis shows the % of the minority population in those CASs. and the red dotted line is the regional average of 28.2%. So we use this data to divide the distribution into 4 parts based on how far above or below the mean the percent of that equity population is in the project area, and assign it a value of 1 through 4, as you can see on the screen. And we do this process for each of the 6 equity populations. So this table then shows how we would weight each population in the index. The base index points column, the second from the left, reflects the values allocated for that population, those values 1 through 4 that I just mentioned. The population weight column in the weighting is the weighting that we'd assign to each population. And we propose weighting the minority, limited English proficiency population and low-income populations more strongly because of their strong federal protections and because of historical discrimination has led them to being underserved and underrepresented by the transportation system and planning in general. So we multiply the base index points by the population weight, resulting in those the values, and add the resulting values together. And the highest index any project could get is 22 if they had a maximum and had a higher percentages of equity populations relative to the average in the region. So once we have that index, we can then score the project. And we want to identify the project's equity multiplier based on the equity index. And this table is a lookup table that shows which index value aligns with which multiplier. And this is really where we're going to need your feedback, especially as we go and reevaluate projects to see how the scoring plays out, because this is where we can adjust these multiplier values to determine how strongly we want to weight equity as part of all the criteria overall. So they can be changed. I came up with those as kind of a starting point of what seemed reasonable, but certainly something that we'd like your feedback on going forward. And so using the projects that were programmed in the fiscal years 2017 to 21, I looked to see what their multipliers would have been. So this is a kind of historical look back at the distribution of those multipliers if we use those, and found that most of the vast majority of projects would have a multiplier of about 1.5, with a couple of outliers above and below that. So I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I just wanted to tell you this as a piece of information you can have when you think about how you may want to adjust some of those multipliers going forward. And then to wrap up, I just want to show you how we would pull this process together to score a project for safety. And this is a hypothetical project. It's not a real project, but the highlighted rows are those that are our equity criteria and where we are applying the multiplier. And you can see that if we didn't apply the multiplier, the project would have received a score of 9 in the safety category. If we applied the multipliers, it would increase to 12.5. So just to give you an idea of kind of the magnitude we could expect to see if we applied a multiplier. So that's it. I'm happy to take any of your questions or recommendations or feedback or comments.
Great, thank you, Betsy. So Len Diggins, you've got your hand raised.
Thank you, Betsy. So I guess what I'm wondering about, well, there are 2 things. It's like, one is that it would be good if we can scale the multiplier to try to correct some of the inequities, because when I participated in the DBDI policy workshop, a lot of us, in fact, it was almost, I would say it was probably unanimous to me that the one thing we wanted to do was to try to correct me for some of the inequities. And we understood the limitations of trying to achieve that goal with what the workshop was trying to accomplish at that point. But I'm kind of wondering if this might allow us a way to get to it. And another is that I'm not really clear on how this could maybe be used, this multiplier, and also inserting the equity component into all the criteria to try to equalize the points that are given to projects. Because in that initial graph that Matt showed, safety has like 30 points and capacity management has nearly 30 points, but equity was low. And as I've said repeatedly, I think we have to justify when any of these categories are not equal to the other. And so this might be a way to get at it. I know the question is convoluted and confusing. That's because I don't really have a good grip on the question myself. But so if you can't answer it, that's fine. I just put it out there. If you want to comment on it, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'll try to answer it and let me know if I do or if I'm totally off base. I think we would like to, generally would like to increase the share of equity points overall. I think what's going to be a little bit confusing, and it's going to be on us to try to be as clear about this as possible, is seeing how the equity points increase if you're doing a multiplier effect rather than having one category. And so we would want to try to pull out, when we evaluate projects, make clear like how much of a project's safety score is actually a result of the equity criteria or equity multiplier versus just the safety component alone. Is that what you're referring to, or am I totally off base?
Can you yeah.
Yeah, you're on base, and I appreciate that answer, and that's really is getting at what I was thinking about. So thank you.
But Betsy, just to be clear, I mean, what you all are proposing is getting rid of the standalone equity section, right? And incorporating equity into every criterion, every section.
Correct. I imagine people want to know, like, overall, like how this
how does it all add up among every section,
yeah.
so that at the end you can say, okay, this project got an extra X amount of points based on all the various equity pieces that are woven in.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Sheila Page.
Thank you. Thank you, Betsy. This is interesting. And I thought it was very interesting as you scrolled through the maps of the region and how almost everywhere at some point has an equity population. So I think the scaling is very important to help get us where we want to be. But I'm wondering if we need a heavier weight for certain things. I'm not sure, but to heavier weight such as in lower income areas, I'm making more pedestrian and bicycle safety somehow weight that higher and include somehow as we talked about before in the safety, including a higher level of injuries, or including that rate higher. I don't know if that makes sense, but to try to get, I just was struck by, the whole region can take advantage of an equity. So we need to make sure we're getting the projects where we want them to be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it is important that we're thinking about need versus the populations we're trying to serve. As part of the reason why we're proposing when we're developing that index is to weight the low-income minority and people with limited English proficiency populations more strongly than the other three populations, because we acknowledge the systematic inequities in the transportation system, particularly for those populations. I think targeting that weighting or adjusting that weighting to different criteria would be very tricky because you get so many permutations. You know, do you weight low income more highly when you're looking at bicycle pedestrian safety versus a different type of safety? So that's where I would be hesitant to get into that level of intricacy, just because of the number, the confusion and permutations that could result from that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's go to Daniel Amstutz.
Hi, thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think I was just going to respond or maybe follow up on Sheila's question. I think I guess the way that I'm reading this, or I remember the discussion we had a few months ago when we were still going to the transportation building, where we talked about the initial kind of index and scoring. And I guess that's maybe similar to what Sheila was saying. I guess I was wondering if the obviously the project is in the same place, so with like once you create that equity score or that equity index, I mean, and then you get the multiplier, you're basically kind of you're using that same multiplier through the entire all the scores that you're actually applying it to, right? So I don't know, I guess I'm just thinking about what Sheila was saying in terms of like, should that multiplier be different or higher if it's like a bicycle pedestrian or you know, or should you just sort of use that same multiplier across the board? I don't know, that's just a thought that came to me as to how this kind of gets applied. But I think I also think it's good to know, yeah, how much of that score does come from the equity piece of it versus the base score.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. That's a really good comment. We will, that's to your second piece of the comment. We'll try to make that clear. We'll make that clear when we come back, kind of, as Matt mentioned, later in July, when we reevaluate those projects using all of the new proposed criteria, and we'll pull out the equity component so you can see more clearly how big a part that is. One thing I can certainly look into is to see potentially looking at different multipliers for different goal areas, since there's 6 goal areas and wouldn't be as big a potentially may not be as confusing if you rather than looking at each impact or each criteria. So we'll discuss that internally and see what we kind of, because your points are well taken. There are maybe certain impacts and criteria that are more important to address in certain communities than others. So we'll certainly talk about that.
Betsy, can you go back to the multiplier slide?
This one?
No, the one that shows the different equity groups. That one. So why does low income population only get a 1 time and minority population gets a 2 time? Like, what was your thinking there?
Yeah, that's a good question. We felt that in combination with the civil rights protections and environmental justice protections that are afforded minority populations, to think about kind of there are different federal regulations and laws that protect different populations, and minority as environmental justice and civil rights. And then just the knowledge of the historic and current systematic inequities in our justice system for the minority population. We felt that it was important to kind of recognize all of those different components, and so we chose to assign it a higher population weight than the others.
Okay, because I would imagine that a big chunk of our minority population is our low income population too, right?
There's strong overlap, yes. I do always like to just kind of be clear about that. That's not always the case, right? There's a lot of overlap in any kind of population description characteristics. But we don't want to assume that minority low-income populations are the same.
Okay. Yeah, the only reason I bring it up is I'm just thinking like, and again, I think it'll be good to test this and see what this means. But there are obviously some communities with, you know, a high minority population, but that population might be relatively wealthy. And you know, just want to make sure that we're kind of, when we're, I think when I would think that most people, when we're thinking about the projects that we want, you know, we want projects in communities and equity that's really like providing a ladder of opportunity for, you know, people who have been historically disadvantaged to, you know, to have, you know, access to jobs and education and basically to create, you know, prosperity and obviously safe, you know, having safe transportation is a big part of that. So I think it's just something, you know, to think about as we test this and make sure that like the Lexingtons of the world don't, you know, benefit greatly because of this.
That's a good point. We can certainly look for what those different how different demographic groups overlap and think about how we're weighting that appropriately.
Daniel, do you have I think Daniel's hand is still raised, so we go back to Daniel.
Oh, no, sorry, I'm fine.
Okay.
I was just waiting for me to be muted and you can.
Okay. Len, do you have another question?
Yeah, it was really actually playing off of what you had said, Eric, and Betsy kind of touched on it. I mean, I think there is a significant correlation between minority and low-income populations. So I'm not too concerned about the minority having a higher weighting than low income. But it would be nice, I think, if we could get some numerical correlation amongst all of these groupings, if that's not too much of a ask on the part of staff. I'd be interested in that, because when you're going through these, it was interesting to see the holes that started developing in Boston, because the elderly population, even though it was pretty widely distributed, there was a lot of yellow in Boston, and there was a lot of yellow in Boston for youth, which kind of surprised me. And so it'd be interesting to, you know, just do correlations in whichever way you feel is insightful to you and possibly us. So that's my ask on that. And that's it. I had something else, but I forget. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
definitely. We can do that.
So Betsy, do you have anything else as part of your presentation?
Nope, this is it. We'll be back next week too, and the week after, joining Matt and all of his presentations. So we can say if things come up, I can talk about it then too.
Okay, are there any other questions or discussion about this safety criteria and the equity aspects of it? So seeing none, Matt, when is our next MPO meeting? We might, I think the next scheduled one is it the 25th?
Sorry,
That's correct.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, it is.
It is the 25th. Okay. So our next meeting is the 25th. And at that time, we will bring the economic vitality criteria to that meeting and we will discuss that. So thank you all. Tegan, did you want to say something?
No, I said yes, we will. And thank you for getting through this with us. We are on a deadline. We are trying to push forward getting through these criteria by a certain time frame. So we will continue to try to push forward with them. But of course, we don't want to shortchange, important conversations. So thank you for bearing with us as we work that out.
Great. So, to be respectful and to stay on schedule, we only have a few more minutes left. So we will, we'll skip item number 12. We will discuss that at the next meeting, and we will go right now to member items. So are there any members items? Okay, seeing none, can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Brian Kane?
Motion to adjourn, Eric.
Okay, and can I have a second from Tom Bent?
Second, Tom Bent.
Okay, so with the prerogative of the chair, if there are no objections, then I'm going to adjourn the meeting. And I thank you all for participating, and the next one will be in 2 weeks, and we look forward to the agenda there, okay? So thank you all. Meeting adjourned.